Hey, Alexis, thank you for fielding these questions from the beginning. I too am in San Francisco, but I am late to our panel today because I was just finishing up a fascinating discussion about using research projects in your college applications, which was my previous panel. But I'm really excited to invite everyone to this group of very talented panelists. I'm going to just give a brief intro now to one of our final panels of the day. This, if you can believe it, is STEM Talk number 21 of our 5th Symposium of Rising Scholars. The roster that we have is really wonderful, including our wonderful judge, Alexis, who'll be scoring each student's presentation. Alexis holds an MS in biology from San Francisco State University and has extensive experience teaching math, biology, organic chemistry at the college level. For my part, I'm trained as an art historian and curator, having earned my PhD from Stanford in the history of art and architecture. But I did have a sort of computational focus within the digital humanities using data science to analyze art and culture. So I'm hoping that some of that background will help me understand the presentations today. We have Akilesh Kale from Doherty Valley High School, Ashna Khemani from American High School, Olivia Snyder from Mount Spokane High School, and Sonya Surapaneni from the Athenian School. Welcome all. We are so excited for your talks. I'm going to invite Aki first, as that was the order that the names were read. So with no further ado,
Hi, can you guys see me?
yes.
All right, cool. So let me just share real quick. It says I need to get access.
I should be able to give you access. So if you see down at the bottom, there's the camera, the microphone, the YouTube, and then the screen symbol. If you click on that, you should be able to share.
Okay. It says I have to give permission to Google Chrome and I have to leave and rejoin the meeting real quick.
Okay.
Yeah. I apologize. Please give me a second.
Aki, would you mind then if we invite another student to go and then you can go as a second presenter? Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Great. Why don't we have Ashna? Is Ashna here? Let me see. Ashna, up at the upper right-hand corner, you can request to present. And once you do, I'll invite you onto the stage with me. There we are.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Looks great. Take it away.
Great. Okay, so I'm Ashna Khemani, and I'm a senior at American High School in Fremont, California. My project was on designing a physical therapy device for lower leg recovery. So first off, what is physical therapy? It's a technique to recover from various conditions using different types of exercises. So if you've ever had a sprain or a fracture, a stroke, or surgery of some sort, you may have done physical therapy to regain some strength and functionality in the affected area. So typically, physical rehab patients visit a physical therapist to better understand their conditions, weaknesses, and what exercises they can do to improve. And while the physical therapist provides guidance and occasional clinical treatment, it is typically the patient's responsibility to actually do the exercises regularly at home. For lower leg recovery in particular, as my research focuses on, resistance bands have been proven to be very effective tools that patients can use easily at home. But using a resistance band can be challenging for some patients, and having consistent resistance force can be difficult and tiring to maintain, especially for people who may not have full function or strength of their upper body. This means that they need to rely on another person to help them with their frequent exercises. So my project focused on allowing such people to be more independent and rely less on others throughout the rehabilitation process. The general idea for my design was to have a machine that could hold an exercise band for the patient while they exercise their foot. And the machine would also have to be able to hold the band in different ways, since lower leg rehab typically involves doing different types of exercises. Because of the severity of conditions would vary among patients at different stages in the recovery process, the machine would also have to be able to adjust the amount of resistance provided. I also aimed to keep the total size and complexity of the design fairly small so it could be used in a home setting or even on the go. So these are the 4 main resistant exercises for lower leg recovery. It's dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, and eversion. And my design aims to help with all 4 of these. So patients typically hold the resistance band at their foot in the different positions as shown, and they try to move their foot against the band. And doing this repeatedly over time can help them steadily regain strength in the lower leg. So for my design, to be able to switch between these exercises easily and effectively, I used 2 lead screw assemblies mounted on a base that would support the patient's lower leg. And the endpoints of the resistance bands would be mounted onto these 2 lead nuts. And when this motor turns, the lead nuts would move along this lead screw. So the band would be moved into different positions. The key advantage of the lead screw assembly is that they're not back drivable, meaning that the lead nuts and by extension the band won't give way or move under the force of a patient's foot. I chose not to use just a linear actuator on its own because they are typically not strong enough to resist the forces that human feet are capable of exerting. Furthermore, a motor resisting external forces continuously means that it will always have to be drawing power from the batteries. So these are the 4 possible configurations for the 4 main exercises that I talked about earlier. So essentially, the dark blue lead nuts are moving to different positions to change the entire band's position relative to the person's foot. And this allows the patient to do different types of exercises. But let's say our patient is having a hard time moving the rubber band because they don't have enough strength yet, so they need less resistance. And the resistance can be reduced by further adjusting the lead nut's position relative to the foot. The main difference here is that there's less of a bend or a stretch in the band, and because of its elastic properties, stretching the band less over a person's foot results in a smaller resistance force. At the end of the general design that I made, I conducted a force analysis to see if such a design is actually possible. And my results show that with that real hardware parts with the right specs can be used to build such a design. The device is capable of adjusting for different exercise modes and intensities depending on the patient's preference. As always, there are possible improvements that can be made. One idea I had for future work is using sensors to analyze the patient's performance and give feedback and possibly adjust the exercises appropriately. The machine could also just track the patient's performance over time, which can be used to create more personalized exercise sessions or just give general feedback to the patient and their physical therapist. And that's all. I'd like to thank my mentor, Katie Hom, for guiding me throughout this project. And of course, everyone here for listening. And I can take any questions.
Ashna, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I love how your project sort of combines both mechanical engineering and then sort of biological science, physical therapy, orthopedic considerations, all of that. And I can say that although many of the students who are listening to your talk right now may not be themselves in the market for physical therapy of this sort of thing, I can say that I have personally used elastic bands in order to rehab feet after injuries that happened while I was rock climbing. So I was listening with rapt attention because I really love the way that this is so modifiable and can be, potentially further enhanced in order to address those issues you're talking about, like personalized feedback, coordination with therapists or with physicians. And I wondered, Alexis has got a great question too. My brief question to begin before Alexis's is, I loved that you were mentioning that this is your work, but that there are avenues for expansion. How do you envision using this as sort of a baseline for either a continued project or for future projects? Is this something that you think you want to, build out into a prototype, or does it feel like it's sort of more of an intellectual challenge that prepares you for the next project?
Well, currently it is more of an intellectual thing. I didn't actually prototype anything, but I think in the future, I might want to expand on this project a little more and, incorporate sensors I talked about to track progress. And I think it would be really fun and interesting to prototype it, because I think that in itself would bring a host of new fun challenges to solve.
That's great. Yeah, as Alexis's question makes clear too, there are sort of practical applications of things, but then there's also the research side that probably was a lot of the background research that you did before jumping into the project. So Alexis asks, is there existing equipment to help with remote physical therapy for other body parts? Is this something as part of the background research before you started your own design work? Did you encounter, or what other sorts of insights did you discover in the course of doing that initial research?
Yeah, so some of the recent technology that has been pretty popular is one of them is an anti-gravity treadmill. What it is, it's kind of like a regular treadmill, but your lower body from the waist down is kind of in this air bubble. So you feel like you're kind of being lifted off the ground. And that way, your leg is not bearing your entire weight and you're able to just steadily increase the strength. But the problem with that is it's not really cheap. You probably wouldn't want to set it up at home every day to work with. And that also kind of falls for the same for VR therapies. While they are effective in a clinic, it's not something that a patient might want to take home with them. And also it's pretty expensive to buy.
I am sure of that. Your presentation, I just want to leave you with this recent article that I read about researchers at Stanford who are doing exploration into exoskeletons so that people can sort of run if they have injuries, or to help them become more active if there are other obstacles to them engaging in this kind of research. And Ashna, your work really made me think of that, and just wanted to highlight this as one of the areas in your field that are just waiting for young researchers like you to grow into and to make new discoveries.
Yeah. Great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Everyone clap through your screens to Ashna for leading us off so wonderfully. Why don't I invite Aki to apply to present, and if he's ready to go, then we'll invite him to do that. Perfect.
I once again want to apologize for what happened earlier.
Think nothing of it. There's always a technical issue to dance around, so we're happy to have you back. Does everything look good to go?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Go ahead, take it away.
All right. So this is a study in drug approval, which is Aduhelm. I'm Akilesh Kale. Sorry. So before I start off, I want to explain why I'm kind of doing this. I think that for a lot of people, science can be kind of mystifying and hard to navigate through, but it's also important to understand how and why science can work in certain ways. For this example, I'll be using the drug Aduhelm. So on June 7th, 2021, the FDA approved a drug, Aduhelm, which they describe as the first treatment directed at the underlying pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. And it was developed by Biogen, and it works by reducing the number of amyloid protein plaques, which are misfolded clumps of protein between nerve cells. Many believe that this method delays the formation of plaques and therefore keeps the nerve connections running. However, controversy has erupted over this decision, mainly because critics of Aduhelm claim it doesn't seem to slow the development of Alzheimer's at all and can actually cause minor brain swelling and microhemorrhages. So about me, I'm a junior at Doherty Valley High School. I have a background in journalism, which led me to develop this idea of a project by combining both neuroscience and journalistic qualities together, which allows me to, blend both of my passions. So in order to understand this subject more, we need to understand the drug approval process. The first step of the pharmaceutical making process is to narrow down the product for use, also known as lead selection. To do this, one must first identify the criteria and biologics that fit these criteria in a process known as target identification. To do this, developers look through a large variety of proteins and gene products from different databases and sources that might help solve the problem. To qualify as a target, the drug made from a protein must meet clinical and commercial requirements and be safe and effective. Through analysis, testing, and modeling, the process of target validation, the developers can narrow down the different candidates to a much smaller list. The techniques used during target validation include models, in vitro genetic manipulation, and protein analysis. Once a narrowed list of candidates is determined, more thorough tests known as compound screening assays and high throughput screening can be developed to test a drug completely and separate the lead candidates from the rest. After this screening, researchers evaluate the lead candidates and further optimize them in hit to lead. Once a biologic has passed through hit to lead, it must be synthesized and modified to reduce the side effects in the lead optimization phase. After a biologic has passed all of these tests, it moves on to the preclinical R&D stage. So these biologics that's passed the first step become lead compounds. This compound must be first tested in animals and isolated human cells in preclinical trials to prove that it's safe to be tested in humans. In addition, the researchers studying the lead compound must determine various details about the compound, including characteristics such as absorption, distribution, disposition, metabolism, and excretion data, benefits and side effects of the lead, effects on various types of people and environments, comparisons to other similar drugs, and the best administration and dosage. Researchers do so by implementing new tests. In vivo, tests done on living creatures other than humans. In vitro, research done in the laboratory. Ex vivo, tests done using animal cells extracted from a non-living animal. And in silico, computer simulations. To prove that the lead compound will have a practical use, developers must complete proof of concept or proof of principle studies. These studies allow them to verify their ideas will work and attract potential investors for the drug, providing funding for the next stages of development. So this clinical development is the stage used to fine-tune the lead compound and optimize it for human use. Through clinical trials, the developers examined the effect of a drug on humans and changed the formula and dosage based on data. Clinical trials can be broken up into several phases. Phase 0 trials signify the first time the drug is tested against humans. A large sample size of 10 to 15 research subjects is procured, and each of them is given a small dose of the drug to determine whether it is safe or not. This phase can give the researchers an idea of whether to move forward or back into the preclinical R&D stage. Phase 1 trials are a large test population made up of healthy human volunteers, no more than 80. The drug's motion and flow through the body, pharmacokinetics, and safety are tested and studied. These trials can also test the side effects of increased dosage. Phase 2 trials are tested on a larger population of several hundred people who all have the condition the drug aims to correct. The participants are tracked for approximately 2 years. This phase gives researchers an idea of the drug's effect and information to move on to phase 3. Phase 3 trials are the most important ones. A population of up to 3,000 people with the target condition is tested, and their condition is monitored for several years. The purpose of this drug is to compare the drug against existing medications that fulfill a similar purpose. To do this, the researchers randomly give each participant either the drug being tested or an existing drug. To prevent bias when interpreting the results, the process is double-blind, which means either that researchers nor the participants know who is being given the drug or an alternate medication. This trial lasts for several years and is often the final step before FDA or other institutions' approvals. After all the tests and results have been completed, it's time for review. Depending on the country a drug is set to be sold in, it needs to pass the tests of that country. 3 of the most prevalent agencies are the United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency, PMDA, in Japan. These 3 agencies have similar ways of approving drugs, but also very different. For the FDA, the drug's developers must submit an NDA, new drug application, to the FDA. The FDA will then have a period of 60 days to file the drug. If they do so, a review team takes over the drug and goes over all the information given by the developers and conducts their investigations. After this complete investigation, they can either approve the drug or send a response letter citing its problems. The EMA has a similar process, requiring the submission of a Marketing Authorization Application, MAA, rather than an NDA. About 6 to 7 months before the submission, the developers can meet with the European Medical Association to run through the application and make sure the quality and information of the application are up to the mark. Unlike the FDA, however, the EMA does not hold the final authority in approving the drug. Instead, they make a recommendation to the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the European Union. Within 67 or so days of the recommendation, the Commission decides whether or not to approve the drug. The PMDA also follows the same pattern, with approvals handled by the Ministry of Health and Labor Welfare. So, Aduhelm, as mentioned previously, is controversial due to its huge drawbacks with little to no benefit. Why? To answer this question, we'll have to look at the various stages given in the previous section and relate them to Aduhelm's design timeline. On March 21st, 2019, Aduhelm is pulled from Phase 3 clinical trials, named Engage and Emerge, respectively. On October 22nd, 2019, Biogen announced its decision to move forward with approval after analysis of a larger dataset showing a slight decrease in the rate of cognitive decline. On July 8, 2020, Biogen completes biologics license application for Aduhelm and submits it to the FDA. The FDA lists it as eligible under the Accelerated Approval Program, which allows the drug approval process to be expedited if the drug fills an unmet niche within medicine. On November 6, 2020, the FDA's Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drugs Advisory Committee voted 10-1 against approving Aduhelm, saying that there wasn't enough information to prove that it slows the progression of Alzheimer's. On June 7, 2020, despite the negative reaction, the FDA approves the drug. Over the next 4 days, 3 members of the advisory committee resigned, with one of them, Dr. Aaron Kieselheim, calling the decision probably the worst drug approval decision in recent U.S. history. We can see from the timeline that Biogen failed to meet the criteria in providing evidence for their Phase 3 trials, except for the slight cognitive decline, at least so that the advisory committee would consider it. The information provided in their NDA doesn't line up with what would normally be expected of an NDA and provides insufficient evidence that it works. These many occurrences might raise eyebrows individually, but paint a very concerning picture when taken together. What casts even more doubt is the price of the drug, $56,000 per year, which begs the question, why does a drug that has not been proven to be effective cost that much? Conclusion. There are definitely flaws within the drug approval process, and we need to understand and keep an eye out for developing cases such as these in order to make sure that no one comes to harm. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Aki, thank you so much for sharing this. I really appreciate how this is able to combine, as you mentioned, those interests that you have on the sort of medical pharmaceutical side and then the journalistic side, and certainly in the way that you described the decisions that go into the sort of successive bad decisions that go into this final release of the drug. It makes what would potentially be a very dry sort of sequence of events into something that sounds like a story that people can sort of jump into. And I'm sure that, like many of you, you might hear some echoes of the current reporting about Theranos and how that trial is playing out with many of the same sort of journalistic approaches. It's really human story and human decisions that are behind these sort of large-scale pharmaceutical practices. So thank you so much for bringing that to our attention. Alexis hadn't heard of this case before, and she wanted to ask, based on your expertise, what do you think are early warning signs of improper drug R&D?
I think since the drug approval process is kind of private, there's not really any early warning signs that the public can know of. But I think if I were a researcher at the FDA, I would look for basically in-depth studies and in-depth research. Basically, you should be providing more than the bare minimum in order to even have a chance at getting it passed, which Biogen definitely didn't do.
You know, Jennifer had a related question. Did you encounter any evidence of lobbyists playing roles? You know, we sort of assume that there might be other hands that are sort of tilting the scales in one direction or another. Is that part of this story?
It might be. To be honest, we don't know a lot about Biogen's motives in this case. They could just be passing off another drug, because there was a similar drug that has done the same effects as Aduhelm, and that has obviously failed. So Biogen decided to do this again. We just really don't know.
Well, it's thanks to the investigation of journalists, young like you or old like Bob Woodard or something like that, reaching into these machinations behind the scenes to bring us up to speed and to reveal this sort of, this bad faith action when it happens. So Aki, thank you so much for this project. You're receiving some claps in the chat, including one from Olivia. And I believe that, let me just yes, Olivia, you are up next. Are you ready to join us with your own presentation? Let me bring you to the stage.
Hello.
Hello. Your background is inspiring. Are you calling us from a forest?
No, I call it a greenery screen because
excellent.
In fact, some
well done.
But yes, let me share my screen with you. And
the floor is yours. Go ahead. Looks great.
Thank you so much. So hello, my name is Olivia Snyder, and I have been researching into plastic roads and their use in rural and urban communities. I've been doing this with the help of my mentor, Violet. So a little about me first. I'm a senior at Mount Spokane High School in Spokane, Washington, and I am a part of the debate team. I enjoy skiing, and I'm really interested in STEM and politics. But what got me into plastic roads was when I was a new driver, I found serious issues with potholes as I continued to encounter them on a daily basis. And so I read about plastic roads and different trial projects happening, especially one at UC San Diego and in India and in Idaho, a bit close to mine. So I found serious interest in this. And then I served as a House page in the Washington State House of Representatives and found that this was a serious issue as I brought it as my mock bill that interested a lot of my peers as well. And so as a kind of roadmap, I'm going to list for you the problems that I really found, the proposed solution that I was looking into, and how it affects rural and urban communities with plastic roads. So in general, there's a serious road problem. Like I said, there's potholes. And especially in the area where I live, we have the perfect recipe for potholes. We have cold, we have moisture, we have freeze, and we have thaw, and that just leads to serious issues on roads. And also, road construction is found to be very inconvenient, especially happening during summer months, where it's much more likely that you'll find weather that's 50 degrees and rising, which is ideal for laying asphalt. And road maintenance isn't able to keep up with the demand that is necessary. It's found that 1 out of every 5 miles of highway pavement is in need of repair. And since there's such a serious backlog, it can't be repaired at the current time. And so the second problem that I really found was plastic pollution. Sorry. There are more than 380 million tons of plastic produced every year. And as humans and our population continues to grow, and we live in generally consumerist societies, this pollution continues to grow. And 9% of the plastic produced is waste plastic. And of this, much of the unrecycled waste plastic ends up in our ecosystems and in the general environment, like the ocean, where over 100 million marine animals perish every year from plastic-related issues. And if they don't die, then it's often found that microplastics end up in their diets, which passes up through the food chain, and they're finding microplastics in humans. And since over the past 10 years, we have started to produce more plastic than in the last century, this is a growing issue that needs to be addressed in some way. And so, and as recycling can't really handle this because plastic is much more difficult to recycle than other materials like glass and aluminum, I wanted to look into finding a different way to do this. So the solution that I found was plastic roads. Plastic roads are made by mixing recycled plastic pellets with bitumen and aggregate materials to form an asphalt. So it's just a general asphalt road, but with a separate binder to replace bitumen, which bitumen is a crude oil byproduct, and the supply continues to dwindle, and it's not infinite. So there's going to need to be a replacement, or at least an additive to make it last longer. And generally, the binding material used isn't foolproof. Roads need to be replaced about every 7 to 10 years, and that's just not long lasting enough for our future society. So the changes that I predicted could be made with plastic roads was minimizing plastic waste in landfills, in oceans, and rivers, and just the general environment, a higher long-term monetary value since current materials are extremely expensive. It would reduce the need for crude oil and these materials that I mentioned, like bitumen. It would extend road durability beyond that of traditional asphalt, as plastic roads are predicted to last about 30 years since they are a newer development. And it will provide for an additional outlet for recycling, since not a lot of materials can be recycled at this point. So my original goal with my project was to find the intersection between science and policy, and how plastic roads could be implemented in a realistic style, especially in my area. And instead, during interviews that I conducted, I found that analyzing the disconnects that exist between rural and urban communities with road construction and how plastic roads could be proposed to either or even be plausible was a much more realistic pursuit, as it's a serious disconnect that exists between the two. And so during the interviews that I conducted, I found that there were a lot of very common elements that popped up. These being weather, especially where I live, where the weather can be extremely high or extremely low. There became a lot of issues in roadways because of this. For example, this summer, there were a lot of roads in my area that collapsed due to heat. And this was an issue that they found with roads, and so another material would have to adhere to weather. There's also materials being expensive to get, and although asphalt is recycled, you can't recycle bitumen, which is increasingly expensive. What also came up was traffic. Obviously, it's road construction, and roads, people need to drive over them, and so they need to be replaced and maintained in realistic fashion. But something that goes along with the materials was cost. And this was something that really came up because budgets are beginning to dwindle for infrastructure construction, especially since a lot of the budget comes from gas taxes, and as vehicles become more fuel efficient, there's less money going towards roads, but there's more traffic. So the disconnect that I found between rural and urban roads was that rural communities tend to focus more on cost. Since half of their budget comes from a gas tax, and more people are moving into the areas of rural communities, especially in the last year, but they have more fuel-efficient vehicles, so there's less money going to maintain it. There continues to be a decline in road condition, but an increase in cost necessity. And recycled materials aren't usually considered in these areas due to their high costs. I found that materials like rubber and various plastics have been proposed in the past, but there hasn't been a second thought put towards them since it's too expensive. But rising costs in bitumen are really concerning since during the summer months, the cost begins to rise, and that's going to increase with years to come as crude oil production goes down, as it's predicted, because it's not an infinite source, like I said. In urban communities, I found there was a focus on time. Since roads can't be closed down for very long with traffic, curing must be fast and sustained so that there's not a lot of maintenance necessary, and the roads need to be strong so a lot of people can drive over them, as well as really withstanding weather and everything going on. So there had to be a lot of focus on time with plastic roads if they would be plausible. And so to kind of summarize everything that I found was that with our current methods, we will not be able to keep up with the future, especially with our roadways. And plastic pollution is truly plaguing the earth. We have a serious issue on our hands, and recycling isn't covering it because there isn't a proper outlet. So we need to find something else. With this, we could encapsulate the plastic waste into roadways in order to find a solution and advance the roads that we take for granted driving over every day. And also, to conclude everything, I found that rural and urban communities have very different focuses for their road construction and what's important. And at the current time, plastic roads are much more plausible for urban use just due to their high cost, but in the future, this could change. So thank you very much, and special thanks to the people that I interviewed, and especially to my mentor, Tyler, who helped me throughout this entire process. So thank you very much.
Olivia, thank you. This is totally fascinating. And there are so many instances with my own personal experience and interests that I'm going to do my best to summarize or bring together for the sake of conversation. But I grew up in Maine, so I totally know what those potholes are like with hot weather in the summer and cold weather in the winter, and just the challenges of maintaining those roads, especially for populations where financial resources are stretched thin. I think one of the most insightful parts of your presentation was the fact that, you know, we have these aspirations to lead more sustainable, environmentally conscious, with practices that are focused on reuse and recycling, but very often we say that sort of thing without thinking about the specific situations that need to take those steps to implement change. And finding that difference between the rural and urban approaches is a great example of how research can lead to more informed policies and decisions. So thank you so much for that part of the presentation. I also want to say that the amount of plastic waste in the ocean, and I know that this is probably something Alexis thinks about as well, it's truly astounding. There's the Southwest Pacific Gyre that is, you know, the size of Texas and growing. And on my own personal research expeditions, one to Southeast Alaska and another into the Arctic Circle, I was on crews, that are both humanities, journalists, scientists. One of the projects was actually collecting microplastics. And we would collect over the course of an hour on the beach between 20 people, more than a ton of plastic waste that, some would be able to haul back with us, but there's just an enormous amount that we still don't know what to deal with. So thinking of ways of using that waste and applying it to infrastructural projects like this is, like I say, really fascinating. And though it's not quite, the point that Alexis is making is microplastics have been found in the stomach of individual tiny coral polyps and leads to massive increase in pathogen susceptibility and coral disease. And not that we should always think in an anthropocentric sort of human-focused way, but these microplastics are now being found in unborn fetuses within mothers' belly. So this is something that we will desperately need to think about, not only for the health of coral reefs and marine life, but also for our own health going forward. So
plastics are such an issue with that. Just they are truly everywhere.
Yes. So there are so many points of connection, as I said. I wanted to share this one link, and you find information about this. I remember inspired when I was in high school by a talk from William McDonough, who is the author of a book called Cradle to Cradle. This book is actually made recycled plastic, so you can take it to the beach or into the bathtub or what have you, but the design ethos that's behind it is that when you're done with something, you shouldn't have to throw it away. So some examples of that kind of design work are tires that braid on the street actually bring nutrients to plants, or a pen that when you're done writing with the ink, you stomp it into the ground and a flower blooms. This kind of creative reapplication of materials that we sort of take for granted, I think, is at the heart of your research project. So thanks for making us all aware of it.
Thank you.
We still have one more illustrious presenter today. So please your claps to his wonderful presentation. And let me invite Sonya to present right now.
Hi.
Sonya, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Just
let me. Oops, 1 second. Can you guys see my screen?
yes.
Okay, great. So hi everyone. My name is Sonya Surapaneni, and today I'm gonna explore the emotional affect of high schoolers when they apply to college. So a little bit about me. I'm a junior at the Athenian School, and I'm an aspiring psychology major. So in the next 10 years, hopefully I'll have a PhD in psychology and maybe go into psychiatry. I have a South Asian background. I lived in India for about 4 years, and both my parents speak Telugu, and I listened to a lot of Telugu growing up. Not very fluent, but that's okay. I'm also an avid advocate for mental health. So I have 400 plus hours with mental health nonprofits. I work with many nonprofits specifically based in India, and I work for underrepresented women, high school students, and anyone who's really involved with depression and anxiety, and I work on destigmatizing that whole process. I have over a year of experiencing an internship under a certified counselor and therapist at my school, and I've also started my own project, a mental health podcast called Youth Speaks, which basically just talks about many experiences of South Asian students, especially in my own demographic in California, and how they can access therapy, because there's a lot of preconceived notions about therapy in South Asian culture. So at a glance, college application rates have increased by 200% in the last couple of years. And with those increasing so rapidly, research rates have also doubled. but research rates have also kind of focused very differently on most prerequisites that you need to get into college. So obviously high schoolers are confused. High school students, just like me, are, stressed about the process. And a lot of research focuses on the specific GPA you need or the extracurriculars you need to get accepted into top colleges, which is about the 20% acceptance rate colleges. It's also focused majorly on Black students in the community and affirmative action, and how affirmative action basically plays into the college process and who it affects. There's also much research on application rates. They're increasingly high and they're getting higher. And there's a lot of research basically on how American parents and even parents from across the world meet USA application rates. And scholarly articles don't necessarily focus on the emotional affect of all of these things. They mostly focus on just the technicalities or the statistics, but there's minimal research basically on the emotional affect of high school students when they apply. So I studied the variables race and ethnicity. So I studied students that categorize themselves in about 8 different races and ethnicity backgrounds. I studied 13 different sexualities, or students who identified themselves as 13 different sexualities, and then 4 different echelons of socioeconomic status. And I also studied how parental pressure, well-being, depression, grade, and application status contribute to the stress and anxiety that high school students go through. So my research questions were to what extent do factors such as socioeconomic status, race, and sexuality relate to high school students' experience of stress and anxiety through the college admissions process. So as you see, my first 2 models that I constructed through my research were focusing on socioeconomic status, race, and sexuality, and my outcomes were primarily stress and anxiety. So when I talk about Model A and Model B, Model 1A is socioeconomic status, race, and sexuality, and Model 1B is depression, well-being, parental pressure, and anxiety. Model 2A would be all of the variables, but for anxiety, and Model 2B would be all of the variables, but also for anxiety. So my survey sample consisted of 198 participants, and I constructed a snowball sampling method to recruit these participants. So this primarily means that I reached out to people saying, hey, send this to your friends, send this to people you know. And since the demographic was mostly in the Bay Area, I oversampled Asian students. So about 50% of my sample consists of strictly Asian students. I also oversampled different sexualities, so people who were homosexual identified as about a third into my study, and usually heterosexual students are about 90% of most studies, so that was largely oversampled. And my socioeconomic status was about 60% upper middle class, 30% middle class, and about 7% lower middle class. So my results were fascinating, to say the least. So I found that South Asian students have a higher role of stress when they're going through college application processes. So the B is the significance. It's the coefficient of the significance, and the p-value is just how rare this is to find in a study. So it's not a coincidence that South Asian students were more stressed throughout the process. People who experienced racism, or high school students who experienced racism, also had more anxiety through the process. And East Asian students, interestingly, had a negative correlation, which meant that if parental pressure was excluded from the model, East Asian students would have the same amount of stress as straight students. So we can see how, as white students, so we can see how significant parental pressure is throughout this whole process. For sexuality, students who identified as lesbian, questioning, unsure, and identified their sexual identity differently had more stress and anxiety throughout the process. Those who chose multiple options or whose sexuality could not be explained by a single term also had more stress, possibly because they, faced a lot of heteronormative culture when going through high school, and obviously explaining your sexuality to multiple people gets tiring. What I found was interesting was aromantic students had less stress when applying to college, partially maybe because they didn't really focus on relationships or finding love throughout their high school careers, which led them to focus more with school and stuff, which was probably the reason that they didn't have as much stress and anxiety, because we know that relationships do cause stress and anxiety. So a couple of other results. So I obviously evaluated socioeconomic status, grade level, parental pressure, well-being, and depression. So those of a lower middle class echelon of socioeconomic status had more stress and anxiety as compared to upper middle class students, and middle class students and lower middle class students were, again, more significantly impacted by all these different variables and did express lower rates of well-being. I also did research on grade level because obviously past research says that the older you get, the more stress and anxiety you have, which was again proved correct through my research. And you can see in all 4 of my models, this is very apparent. For parental pressure, we evaluated that through 2 or 3 questions that I made up by myself, and also just a short response of how parental pressure impacts student ability to function. So parental pressure also contributed to stress and anxiety, especially with Asian students, as we saw before. And as it says, higher rates of depression also cause higher rates of stress and anxiety, which is proven by the literature multiple times. But yeah, thank you so much. This research was super fun. It was super interesting. And a special thank you to Nicole Yates, who is here today, for being absolutely amazing throughout the whole process. She was super flexible, and I definitely could not have done it without her. Thank you so much.
Sonya, this was just fascinating. There are so many things that I want to draw out from the presentation. The first is really, in our keynote address from Professor Margot Gerritsen, she talked about the challenges of collecting data and how very often when we're doing exercises in school and the kind of regression analyses that you were doing to find correlation, sometimes we're given these data sets that make things so easy, sort of artificially easy. And I think that what your research showed, as you mentioned, is that there's always the potential to sort of oversample a certain group within a population, and that's something you have to be really mindful of when you're drawing conclusions to sort of temper the results when you present them afterwards. So thank you so much for showing us the process by which you arrived at those wonderful conclusions. And so much of them are deeply, meaningful for all of us right now, because there are lots of students attending who are in the process of applying to college. We think about this a lot as a team at Polygence, because we know that by putting a lot of emphasis on your marks in high school, it can feel very overwhelming just to think, oh no, I can't get a B or else I'm gonna get into a good school and my life would be a wreck and everything. I can say that I got some B's in high school and things have turned out really well. I'm not thinking back at that time. I know there wasn't the same pressure that some students are experiencing now. But I also want to say that there are other interesting demographic changes that are sort of coming. There will be, we've seen this sort of astronomical increase in applications to college, but the number of students who will be applying will actually be going down in the coming years. So let that not be missed when people are thinking about the intimidation of a world of increasing competition. And I also think the point that you raise about the parents wanting the best for their children, but actually not intentionally putting more pressure, potential pressure on them. Something that we really focus on is giving students the chance to find something that is meaningful. And I think that your work is deeply meaningful to all of us. And that once you find meaning in the work that you do, you can sort of rise above the grades that you're getting. You can find something that actually inspires you. So to also push that out into the world and into our panel to students know that finding those things can really be a way of counteracting those pressures, those anxieties, that social and mental sense of disease or illness that people might be experiencing.
For sure.
So Alexis has please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to answer the question in the chat.
Please.
So I did not include this in my PowerPoint, but actually through my research, I found that higher rates of well-being were also expressed with higher rates of stress and anxiety, which was very odd because the literature often says that, the better your well-being is, the lower rates of stress and anxiety you have. So that was something that I found, and it did have a significant p-value, which I found was really, really interesting because I did not actually know how to explain that. And all of the literature that I went through still didn't really like give me the answer for that. So I'm just thinking that, you know, the data could have been skewed, or maybe people put in higher responses than they could have. But that's still something that I want to research in the future.
Yeah, that's one of the satisfying things about these things. It's sort of like the results reveal those areas that you wouldn't have thought to look into, but you're like, oh, there's another question to be asked and answered there. So that's the next step that I'm going to take.
Right.
Well, I would love to, in the time, have we already gone over? I wonder. I would love, and for the last few minutes anyway, to have maybe the other students who presented rejoin us on the dais, and to have even Alexis, if she wants to join us, to offer some sort of summary observations or questions for people, just to invite you back up. One question I know that was in the Q&A that I'll ask now while the other presenters and potentially Alexis join us was asked by you at the beginning. What led you to this idea or project? It's sort of a question that I wanted to ask all of the presenters. Maybe, you know, quickly, Sonya, how did you arrive at this project, and what led you there?
Yeah, well, I actually did an internship my freshman year, and they talked a lot about like research and going in the lab and kind of like experiencing that whole thing before you went to college. And I was always super confused because the first time that I heard about it was always with cold emailing professors. And just kind of, I know like Olivia, you probably do have prior experience with this too, but it's like a super confusing process. And we had like a bunch of tips, how to write emails, all of that. And I think when I found Polygence, it was like the perfect way for me to execute kind of what I wanted to do. I was already interested in psychology. I knew that when I entered Polygence. And I think it just kind of gave me a platform to take my knowledge further and actually develop this research. And Nicole was like a huge part of that. You know, she kind of helped me figure out what exactly I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it, how I wanted to execute it. And I literally cannot thank her enough for that.
So happy to hear when those connections really, you know, help ideas take flight. Sonya, thanks for that. Olivia, how did you arrive? I know that you talked about, you know, your background and location being sort of an inspiration, but how did you arrive at the idea for the project?
Ever since I read about plastic roads, they've been constantly on my mind because plastic pollution is really like something that causes a lot of grief to me. Just like I'm imagining it, because like as a child I was exposed to like the truth about like how much there is out there, and I just like reading about plastic roads, I was constantly talking about them, which probably annoyed a lot of people, but I was just like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard of. And since I'm in debate, I wanted to write a student Congress bill on them, talking about plastic roads and possibly using them. And so when I was able to write a mock bill and present it at my state capitol, I got really good responses from my peers saying that they wanted to hear more about it. And so that really carried me through. When I found out about Polygence, I was like, this is the thing I want to do. I knew right off the bat, I was like, I'm doing plastic roads, because it's truly a passion project.
That's excellent. Yeah, you know, I'm always inspired to hear, sometimes we have these ideas and we just need to find we need to find our people, you know, we need to find the right support, the right interlocutors, the right mentors to help us chart that path. So I'm really glad, Olivia, that you were able to take that thing that was already inspiring to you and the basis for a lot of exploration and sort of take it to the next level with some guidance too. Ashna, what was your experience like? You know, it's a really sort of specific therapeutic device that you were developing. I'd love to hear about why you chose it.
Yeah, sure. So sorry, I don't know what happened to my camera. But actually, a few months ago, my mom took a pretty bad fall, and she ended up breaking her ankle, and she completely tore like her ligaments in the other ankle. and she was struggling a lot to do physical therapy on her own. So she was always like, "Can you just hold this band while I do it for like 5 minutes?" And I was like, just standing there, and I was thinking, I'm pretty sure I could use a machine to do this instead. And so that's how I kind of got the idea and got to work designing the machine.
Amazing. Well, of course, we're all sorry that you had a family member that had to go through that kind of injury, but I think those personal connection style projects are some of the most relatable, and also the ones that you can really put the full weight of your effort and intellect behind. So I'm really happy that that was an outlet for you, and that all of you were able to find that are meaningful and turn them into projects that you can share with everyone. We have gone over our time. Thank you so much to all the presenters. You've done an amazing job. I have personally learned so much from all of you. And I want to remind you all that we are so very near the end of the presentations. We actually have only the closing ceremony that we're a few minutes late to. So if you want to skip to that, Stephen will be wrapping things up, I believe, for just about 10 minutes. Thank you. Keep the claps coming, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you.